Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. Netanyahu's pivot against Hizbollah and now Iran appears to have gained him new support at home, despite the prospects of an even wider war in the Middle East. At the same time, former Israeli generals are arguing for an even tougher approach in Gaza, and there's little hope of a hostage deal anytime soon. Is this really what Israelis want? To help answer this question, we have the expert Israeli political and polling analyst Dahlia Scheindlin with us. Hello, Dahlia.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Good to have you with us. This is going to be 30 minutes. It's going to be rapid fire. That's something you're very used to. So please, everyone who's watching, get your questions in quickly because we're going to come to them earlier than usual. Straight off the top, Dahlia, how has Israeli opinion on the war shifted since the summer?
Since the summer. First of all, we have to define which war, because we have several wars going on at once. There's the war in Gaza, there's the war against Hizbollah, and there is the increasingly active front with Iran, not to mention other smaller military exchanges of fire with Houthis in Yemen and Iraq and Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and sometimes Syria. So I think Israelis are primarily constantly in a situation of trying to keep up. Of course, the one in terms of what they think. In terms of the war in Gaza, there's a sweeping consensus that it's a justified war among Israeli Jews. Arab or Palestinian citizens of Israel feel much less supportive of the general justifications for the war, but there is a growing lack of confidence in polls. We see this, a declining confidence that Israel can achieve its goals in the war. That's one measure of change that we've seen. And it's not just since the summer, it's been going on for months, I would say roughly since the spring. There's been an erosion. It's still high because Israelis are still, on some level, not able to entertain any other option than war. They have not been told any other option from their political leadership, but there is an eroding sense that Israel can achieve its aims. Certainly, there's a majority who do not believe in the concept of total victory, which was a mantra the prime minister was using for the first 6 months. But already by April, 2/3 didn't believe him about that. And so even if there's still a majority who think Israel can achieve its bigger aims, which are supposed to be release of the hostages, beating back Hamas or toppling them and allowing the citizens of the South to return home, the confidence has been eroding, although it's still a majority among Israeli citizens. Now, there's also divided opinion about the war with Hezbollah in Lebanon. A majority who think Israel should have undertaken and should have, even before, that Israel should have had a serious strike on Hezbollah, because Hezbollah has been firing into parts of sovereign Israel, essentially, displacing tens of thousands of Israelis from the north. So there was majority support for a significant escalation against Hezbollah, but there is significantly divided opinion about the ground operation, which was based on a poll by the Israel Democracy Institute the very day the ground operations started. And that's because people know that ground operations carry enormous dangers. First of all, to the lives of soldiers. Secondly, they're in danger of never ending. And that's why I think Israelis are both fearful and divided. And again, you have to understand that the discussions around these issues here do not truly focus on any alternative to major military action. And so people have a hard time imagining that.
At the same time, has the pressure on the government to come up with a deal to release the hostages ebbed in the wake of an increasingly bigger conflict? If you've got a war going on in Lebanon and a conflict taking place now with Iran, it would seem to me that the hostages have almost become a distraction for the government.
Well, the hostages have been a distraction for the government from the beginning. The government, as far as we read the government, wasn't really planning on reaching a deal to release any hostages until public pressure began in the early weeks of the war. It was considered a contributing factor to the government achieving or agreeing to the deal that was the only deal so far for hostage release in late November. And since then, the government has neglected to reach a deal for all the reasons for lots of reasons we can talk about, but against public pressure, because the majority of the public consistently in surveys throughout this time have preferred to reach a hostage release ceasefire deal rather than the other aims of the war, whichever were tested in that particular survey. And the majority for a hostage release deal has been consistent over time. The government has still not acquiesced. So again, it's not really a change based on the current escalation. However, there is a change in the level of public expression of that desire to reach a hostage release deal, which would include a ceasefire. And the reason is simply because the public was making itself, its preference is known through massive demonstrations consistently, weekly, sometimes, oftentimes more than once a week. And of course, the families of the hostages were almost daily and nightly demonstrating for a hostage release deal. But those mass protests, simply by force of reality, they could not continue in the mass form after the Iranian strike because people are simply afraid to go out, and there are also instructions from the Home Command. If too many people gather, there's a likelihood that too many people will be killed in the event of a rocket attack. And so there have not been mass demonstrations, but I think the feeling in the public is no less committed to hostage release, but people are deeply and existentially distracted by the fear, by the reality of both the escalation with Iran, the rocket attacks, Israel's potential response, which Israelis, probably support. We don't have a lot of data on that, but they are afraid, of course, of what the results will be. And so every day there's a kind of chaotic security and existential distraction. But I don't think Israelis are less committed to hostage release. They're less able to demonstrate it. And I think the frustration and anguish is not relenting in any way.
It would seem to me that Netanyahu's have reigned supreme. He's long been an advocate of military intervention against Iran. Even die-hard political adversaries like Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid, leaders of the official opposition, of supporting operations in Lebanon, saying it's the chance for Lebanon to become, quotes, a normal state again. Netanyahu is a step ahead of everyone.
Is he a step ahead of everyone? I mean, it depends on which parameter you're looking at, and he has supported military intervention. But the fact is, he has been prime minister for pretty much the last 15 years, with a small exception of about 18 months. And he did not escalate military action against Iran. And that's for one reason, because he knows that he can't do it without American support, both politically and militarily. And I don't know if he had that sort of blanket or blank check support from America to do that over the years. I'm still not convinced he would have done it. But nevertheless, he has been a forceful advocate of, let's say, some sort of war or escalation in the Middle East that would bring in Iran and that would give the U.S. or pressure the U.S., create the conditions by which the U.S. had to be involved in such a military strike against Iran. And so now that those conditions have happened, he is certainly, I have become convinced that he is capitalizing on them, and that certainly after the assassination of Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah, he clearly anticipated that there would be an Iranian response. And I think that he was probably somewhere in his mind, without wanting to psychologize too much, but from all of the evidence I've heard from people in the room in past years, he has wanted that situation and that opportunity. And there's no doubt that he would have seen that as the opportunity. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that the regional front, the fight with Hezbollah and against Iran, is much more unifying within Israeli politics. Even the war in Gaza, let's say, really has widespread support of all major Israeli political parties. And I say major, i.e. the ones in the coalition and the opposition, leaving out, of course, parties representing the Palestinian citizens of Israel. But even the left-wing opposition among the Zionist and Jewish parties approve of that war. But still, the divisions over the hostages tap into longer-term divisions over Israel's policy of occupation, and the lack of a horizon for political resolution. The fight with Hezbollah and Iran has none of that controversy in the Israeli public mind. It's a simpler story of external enemies attacking Israel in its sovereign areas due to its existence. And you know what? That's because there is a very strong evidentiary basis that Hezbollah and Iran and the network or axis of, as it calls itself, axis of resistance, frankly, are not interested in the question of occupation from 1967. They fundamentally do oppose Israel's existence. Whether or not they would take action truly if it hadn't been for this war, well, that's a parallel to the question of whether Netanyahu would have taken military action if not for this war. But the intentions are certainly there. And in fact, so I would say that there is much more rallying. There's much less division or anything like, and the problem is there's not even an alternative. Israeli politicians are not even proposing an alternative to this major escalation in the region. And yes, the opposition parties are also joining in, the general call to use this as an opportunity to reshape the Middle East, foment regime change in Lebanon or Iran, both of which I think history should have proven folly. And recent history, the America's exit from Afghanistan wasn't that long ago and the takeover of the Taliban, but somehow or other, people still talk with a straight face as if we can avoid the fate of Iraq and Afghanistan and the entire history of the Cold War.
I want to emphasize that because, former Mossad chief Tamir Pardo was talking about this too. This is an opportunity. Israel should use this opportunity to reshape the Middle East. Do you think that's an earnest intent? I'm being cynical here. I just think that Netanyahu is opportunistic and that this is something that ensures his political survival. And these are ally, he's had that goal. But does he seriously think that he's going to get rid of the regime in Iran? Does he really think that Lebanon is going to suddenly become a different state and Hizbollah and the Shia are going to have no role in it?
Well, I think that, first of all, it's always a mistake to underestimate Netanyahu's ideological commitments. Yes, he is opportunist. Yes, he wants to stay in power, and he has long-term ideological tenets. And the two most basic and core enduring tenets of his ideology are rallying the world against the threat of Iran, and that Iran truly is a threat to Israel and the entire world, and the source of a lot of what's wrong with the world. And the other one is preventing anything like Palestinian statehood, and ideally destroying Palestinian nationalism. So those are the two very consistent guiding ideological principles that cannot be reduced to his opportunism, his desire to stay in power, and his desire to to somehow evade or circumvent his corruption charges. All of those predate the corruption charges by about 30 years. So that's one thing. Now, the question of whether he truly thinks that he can engineer regime change in Iran or Lebanon, I credit Netanyahu with being an avid reader of history, with having a strong grasp of global affairs. And therefore, I would say if I had to conjure or imagine how he would think about this, he's probably more skeptical than he can, single-handedly bring about regime change in those two countries. But I think he is not at all cynical and not at all skeptical of Israel's ability to generate the conditions to re-engineer the power structure of the Middle East. And there has been for years, this is not new, for some years already under Netanyahu's rule, there has been a kind of underlying widespread agreement that it would be very nice for Israel if there was a binary Cold War style division between what Israelis like to call the moderate Sunni countries, or which basically translates into potential allies of Israel, or authoritarian Arab states is another way of putting it. That, which includes the Abraham Accord partners, the potential for Saudi normalization, et cetera. There has been an image and a sort of desire to have those be one axis, an Israel, Arab, American axis of, a binary division in the Middle East against the axis of resistance. And that those two big blocks would, have, again, sort of either a stalemate or a confrontation where one eventually defeats the other. Obviously, the Israeli-American Arab axis is this kind of NATO-like vision for the Middle East that has characterized not only this kind of unifies the hawkish military and security right in Israel and the far-right messianic religious ideological forces. They can all agree on this vision, and I think that they all see this as an opportunity to advance that perspective. And I think the most far-reaching accusation or criticism of Netanyahu is that he not only wants to, create a favorable geopolitical strategic environment in the Middle East, but that he wants to be king of this empire in the Middle East. And I think that is also generating, its own very escalatory dynamic among the axis of resistance, which sees him going beyond geopolitical reengineering to, returning to an era of territorial conquest. I think the Axis powers or the axis of resistance countries, particularly Iran, they are convinced that Israel has designs of an empire, wants to conquer parts of Lebanon, annex them, settle them, parts of Jordan, parts of Iraq. I mean, they see it as generally wanting to expand Israeli sovereign territory in a very medieval sense. So that's all playing into the escalatory dynamics.
Okay, let's take some questions. Vaughan Grills to start with. Please, Vaughan, open your microphone, and please, everybody else, do get your questions in quickly, because this is going to be a shortened version of the program, and we will wrap up early. Vaughan, go ahead, please.
Hi, Dahlia. Good to see you again. I just wanted to ask you how far the government in Israel is feeling the pressure and is concerned about the outcome of the US election. And if they are, is this one of the reasons why they are going for it while they can? I mean, presumably the concern there would be if Harris is elected president, and they're going for it while they can, while they've got a lame duck president in Washington.
Yeah, I think that there's, it's hard not to put the pieces of the timing together. I mean, it's always a little bit, dangerous or far-reaching to impart very conspiratorial decisions about timing to any party. But let's say it looks like it wasn't an accident that Israel, is undertaking this major escalation against Hizbollah and Iran in particular just before the U.S. elections, which I have argued puts America into a trap at such a sensitive political moment. Either America kind of stands by passively and then it looks weak at home, and then it's bad for the Biden administration, or it gets dragged into the war. And looks like it's dragging itself into a forever war, which also doesn't look good for the Biden administration. So I think that Netanyahu certainly had that timing in mind. Whether it was his driving factor or not, I cannot say. I will say that I think that the Biden administration may. So yes, there's concern in Israel about. I mean, and this I'm saying from kind of at the anecdotal level among both the public and elites, that another Democratic presidency under Harris will not be good for Israel, because there's this kind of bizarre caricature that Democratic administrations somehow limit Israel, which really bears no relationship to what the Biden administration has done on Israel, which has frankly placed no limitations almost at all throughout this time. Now, as of yesterday, the U.S. has taken what I call, not an inch up the ladder, but maybe 2 inches up the ladder of its policy pressure on Israel by issuing a letter from the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense that Israel must comply with National Security Memo number 20, which stipulates that Israel and all recipients of American foreign military aid need to respect human rights and international human rights law. The administration has long been concerned that Israel is violating that. And now they're saying if they don't, that Israel's at risk of violating the terms of that memo, which is essentially a kind of conditionality, a warning that America would be under pressure to limit its exports if Israel doesn't supply more humanitarian aid to Gaza. And so it's almost like the American administration is saying we're not going to be pushed around entirely by Israel's desire to escalate before the elections. I mean, I was just struggling with how to phrase this in an article I was writing, because I don't want to imply that the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense would bring political considerations into such a serious foreign policy issue. And I don't truly think they would. But I have no doubt that American swing voters in Michigan, particularly Arab Americans, or anybody who is, deeply alarmed at America's blank check, essentially no limitations on Israel's policy, the kind of people who are protesting on campuses or simply, morally and intellectually concerned about, or anguished about the war. I have no doubt that they will see the U.S. move as politically cynical, regardless of the actual considerations of Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. So there is, of course, a political timing here. There's no question Netanyahu believes Trump would be better for Israel, but I think that that's also a big open question. Trump is nothing if not erratic. And his greatest test of, his greatest guidance for policy is about personal loyalty of the people he's dealing with. So he was already angry at Netanyahu for 2 years because Netanyahu accepted the results of the U.S. elections eventually. And, I think it's foolish if Netanyahu's depending on a Trump presidency to save him, but it seems clear that he would prefer that outcome. He's had no problem antagonizing the U.S. relationship over this whole time.
Take a question from Sarah Biffin.
What I wanted to ask is, after 1 year of almost constant war in different directions, how much has everyday life changed for the citizens? And are they very much affected by what's going on?
But so talking about Israel, and I guess that my additional question to that would be, how sustainable is a long war like this if you have constantly people going into air raid shelters? Is economic life disrupted? One can think of the parallel in Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, it is very disrupted. I mean, it can be a little bit deceptive because it's nothing like Gaza. I mean, Gaza has been, completely destroyed. Nearly 100% of Gazans are displaced. Civilian infrastructure has been wrecked. People don't have access to food, water, or fuel, medicine, or health services. So, I mean, the sewage system has collapsed. I mean, it's nothing like that. And, we have to kind of remember that in some ways, physically, life looks more normal if you walk around, Tel Aviv, but it is not normal. I mean, of course, we have regular rocket attacks. We are, any minute there's sirens going off, not every minute, like in the northern parts of Israel, but in the northern parts of Israel, including sovereign, not occupied parts, in civilian communities, they're uninhabitable right now. So in many ways, for a big part of this year, until people started going back to their homes in the south, Israel had effectively shrunk. Its sovereign areas were parts in the north and the south were uninhabitable. And so it had shrunk into what we often kind of, have observed, ironically, are the borders of the original partition plan in 1947, right? Of Israel during the War of Independence conquered territories beyond the partition plan, which is why we talk about Israel having 78% of historic mandate Palestine. But originally it was only supposed to have 55%, and it was almost like Israel had contracted. Now, more people have gone back to their homes in the south, but the north has become even more uninhabitable as the areas under fire have expanded alongside the escalation with Hizbollah. So for a whole swath of the north right now, way beyond just the border areas, the 5 kilometers from the border, as far south as Haifa, there's such regular rocket fire that life is completely different. And some people have left those areas temporarily. In Tel Aviv, even though we're not directly in the line of fire, we do have regular attacks. Just 2 days ago, I was having a quick meeting at an outdoor cafe, and there was sirens in the middle and rockets and interception. Last week, I visited cousins in a town just a bit north of Tel Aviv, but nowhere, not close to the Israeli north. And a few days later, there was the drone attack on the military base nearby that killed several soldiers. So everybody's rattled, everybody's lives are disrupted. The economy is, being kind of slowly overhauled because of this. Budget deficit is going up. The defense budget has risen 87% relative to last year. There are going to be severe cuts to both ministries and probably higher taxes that will be very widespread. 46,000 businesses have closed. That number is expected to reach about 60,000 businesses, including small businesses. There has been a high-tech investment or a venture capital investment slowdown, which is very significant because that's one of the main drivers of the Israeli economy, but two qualifying factors. There's been a slowdown around the world over the last couple of years, so it's not only because of the war. And some of this damage is offset by a record high of military export, including a lot of cyber export over the last year. And that's, or in 2023, let's say, and even that was largely driven by the end of 2023. And the reason for that is that Israel typically in wartime has a lot of very, substantially battle-tested equipment to sell. And whatever condemnations you hear of Israel's policies, countries always need to buy weapons. And so it's somewhat mitigated, but the rhythm of life is different, not only because of rocket attacks, but because so many businesses have closed, so many people are in the army that there's not enough human resources. Many businesses that are open close early, so everything is different, not to mention, of course, the number of people who have either been killed, wounded, or families and circles of communities who have been affected because they know somebody killed or wounded or kidnapped. Israel's famously small, tight, and very community-oriented. Everybody knows somebody with a very few degrees of removal. So is it sustainable? I mean, we'd like to think no, given everything I said, but I've learned not to underestimate the sustainability of things that look impossible when you're still getting used to them. But habituation is the biggest danger.
We got a question from Peter Sullivan just coming in, but we need to get him promoted.
Oh, Peter.
as a panelist. Yeah. So there's Peter. Go to your question.
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Dahlia. Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted. We can hear you.
Wonderful. Dahlia, Israel's got 300 F-16s, but it's ordered 50 F-15s, I understand, which is an older aeroplane, but faster. And I wondered whether this was because it would use those for an attack on Iran, because F-16s seem better for the closer countries.
Well, I think you're hitting up against the limits of my military analysis. I think that the main issue here, I'm not going to speak to the difference between F-15s and F-16s because I just don't know them enough. And I have to often tell international, global media outlets who reach out to me on things like, very technical military analysis that please read my material. I am a political analyst. And of course, I have been forced into the role of a war analyst as well by circumstances. But I really can't answer that question with any authority. What I will say is that Israel has been very clearly trying to communicate what it's capable of in terms of military strategy, right? So attacking the Hudaydah port of Yemen after a Houthi drone smashed into a civilian building in Tel Aviv, just down the road, killing one person back in July. I mean, that was very much leverage to try to communicate the distances that Israel is capable of striking. And then there's the intelligence factor. I think that, striking at, for example, Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader, ex-political leader of Hamas, because he's dead now, assassinating him in Tehran was also a form of communicating. Not only did it achieve Israel's goal of assassinating high-level figures, but it communicated that Israel has the intelligence capacity to penetrate countries that are considered impenetrable. Of course, hitting Nasrallah was another way of saying Israel's intelligence can penetrate, even the best guarded secrets of location, et cetera. So I think that, I don't know as much about the hardware, but I can tell you that Israel is making an effort to communicate what it's capable of. And on the other hand, what I can also weigh in on is the fact that it's clear that Israel not only needs American political backing for a strike in Iran, but it would need American military backing, particularly for that, not just American military support per se, to help handle whatever response would come from Iran if Israel, continues with a serious response. And also we're hearing about shortages. We have shortages of interceptor rockets right now. So, or at least that's what's being reported. It's a little bit hard to know exactly because there's a lot of, attempt to obfuscate the details of that. But for for analysis of different fighter planes, I can certainly refer you to some of my colleagues who absolutely love analyzing specifically fighter planes. Two of my colleagues one is still at Haaretz, Avi Sharf. You can read his stuff. He writes about that. And Anshel Pfeffer, who's now full-time at The Economist. Those would be the two people best placed to answer that. Or Amos Harel, the other military analyst, the defense and military analyst for Haaretz.
Dahlia, I do want to talk about the West Bank and in terms of Israeli attitudes, in terms of how the Palestinian Authority should be handled, but also generally in terms of the population. You've got a substantial Palestinian population there. There's a sense in Israel that nothing can be the same again after October the 7th. So what does that mean for the West Bank? And we know that obviously the government has got the hardline West Bank, settler supporters within it. But generally, is there a sense that things have to change there too in Israeli society?
Well, let me just clarify one thing. The Israeli government as a whole is committed to the annexation of the West Bank. These were in the founding government guidelines of the government that was established on December 29th, 2022. Okay. The coalition agreements and the government's basic guidelines called for the government to advance plans for annexing Judea and Samaria. Or they call it sovereignty, but it's the same thing. They also established a minister whose essential purpose is to regularize Israeli law over settlers and essentially push Palestinians out by virtue of making their conditions more difficult. So those plans were well underway before October 7th. And I think that the war became an opportunity to I mean, partly out of necessity. I don't want anybody to dismiss the genuine, security and military escalations going on due to the typical combination of Israeli raids and incursions into Palestinian areas of the West Bank and Palestinian attacks on Israeli civilians throughout 2022 and 2023. Those were already escalating before October 7th, and of course settler violence, because the settlers have felt they have backing from the government. And so settler violence is becoming very serious, has been for years, but even more serious. And so the combination was already very, very flammable and combustible. And then on October 7th, the government immediately shut down the entry of Palestinian workers into Israel, meaning extreme economic pressure, because you have, suddenly 150,000, maybe 200,000 Palestinians with no income. Israel then froze the clearance taxes, the taxes that it collects for the Palestinian Authority and is supposed to transfer to them, meaning that the PA suddenly had, slashed its revenue, and was losing the taxes that the workers in Israel would have paid. So the PA is on the verge of economic collapse. People are unemployed, and the pressure is enormous, and the chaos is rising. And settler violence continues, and the army participates in it. And so all of these things are creating chaos. The army went in and did a very extensive operation in refugee camps back in, I think it was late August. And so I think these are laying the groundwork for something the government has already wanted and begun to do to begin with, which was formalize annexation. And so, like in so many aspects of this war, there is some continuity with aims that were well articulated and already underway before, but this is an opportunity to accelerate them and do them when there's a little bit less attention. I mean, and the attention goes in waves, right? 1 minute it's Gaza, 1 minute it's Hizbollah in Lebanon, 1 minute it's the West Bank, the next minute it's Iran. The public can't keep up. And in any case, the public elected this government, even though only by, razor-thin margin. In fact, this government didn't actually receive a majority of the votes. We know about those systems and their glitches from the US, but and from to the UK for that matter too, to some extent, but lesser. So, it is a serious, I think, almost an inevitability, unless there is some massive pressure brought to bear for Israel to reach a comprehensive agreement with the Palestinians, which of course is not anywhere in the cards right now, that Israel essentially, the annexation of the West Bank is almost complete in all but name, and with differing forms of regimes over different, sub-territories. And the question is, what is the political future? Because de facto, it's complete.
Dahlia, there we must leave it. We could talk about that at some length too. Thank you very much.
I am on another Zoom. Thank you.
Really, really good conversation. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah.